Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're looking at the standoff over the Crimean Peninsula, where Russia continues to consolidate its presence there. With us, our France 24's very own Douglas Herbert, who's been reporting throughout the past few days from there. Also joining us, Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, now with the McCain Institute for International Leadership. Here in the studio, Joelle GARRIAUD, senator from the conservative UMP party here in the upper house of the French Parliament, and Celestine, journalist and columnist for the International New York Times. Dmitry LINNIK, the London bureau of Voice of Russia, is also with us. Thanks for being with us. Dmitry, let me get, first of all, your reaction to this decree signed today by the Prime Minister, in which he says he's going to build a bridge before November between the Russian mainland and the Crimean Peninsula. It really has all the trimmings that there is this consolidation, that Crimea, for all the talk, is going to be squarely under Russia's influence for good.
I'm not sure if that's really the course of events. The bridge deal was discussed and signed with the government of Ukraine in December, I think, last year. There's been talk about that for a long time. Of course, it is in the interests of the Russian Federation to provide for its fleet there, which is there under a two-way agreement, which is in force until 2042, so a long way to go. And of course, Russia needs to, have the supply line not going through directly Ukrainian territory. So that's my response to this one.
All right, ahead of his Tuesday trip to Kiev, the U.S. Secretary of State on Sunday issuing a stern warning to Moscow. Let's take a listen.
Russia may be able to invade Crimea, but in the end, Russia will isolate itself. There will be cost to the economy of Russia, cost to Russian businesses, cost to Russian individuals.
All right, the cost to Russian businesses and to Russian individuals, sanctions being discussed by the U.S. Senate. Both of Moscow's main stock indexes feeling that cost on Monday. The dollar-denominated RTS down 13%, the other major index sliding 8.3% in heavy trading, while the ruble hitting a record low against the euro and the dollar. I guess my question to you, Dmitry LINNIK, is with markets running for cover, is that going to make Moscow rethink its position in Crimea?
I don't think so. That's temporary. The market will right itself, as it has done in the past. And actually, if we talk about that, the European stocks have gone down as well. But that's temporary. That will live through that, will pull through that. But I would like to go back to some fundamental issues, if I can. First of all, and that has been mentioned, thankfully, that Russia does have its geostrategic interests. That needs to be recognized. That's number one. Number two is that the whole conflict is not about the good people of Ukraine versus, a bad Putin or a bad Yanukovych, for that matter. The thing is that Ukraine is split down the middle pretty much, with the West sort of gravitating to the West, to Europe, and the East gravitating linguistically, historically, to Russia. That needs to be recognized as well. So it's not like, Kiev has been, the powers in Kiev have changed through the will of the people, but what is going on in Crimea, in East Ukraine and South Ukraine, that is not the will of the people? That is not true.
Celestine.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the problem here is that the people on the Maidan were by and large protesting peacefully. Yes, there were some radical elements. Yes, they need to be brought under control. And yes, the government, the new government or the Maidan leaders should have done more to speak out against them. Having said that, that's a very different story than people who are whipped up by a kind of a propaganda campaign that identifies all of those people, including the ones who were killed, with neo-fascists dating back to the World War II era. I mean, you know, frankly, the fascist label is not one I would toss around too quickly if I were among certain groups in Russia. Frankly, there's a kind of a use of propaganda here that's absolutely incendiary, a move to protect a population that is not in physical danger in Crimea, and therefore, you know, I agree that Russia has strategic interests, and I think that Russia should speak to those interests and deal with them in a normal, you know, civilized political way. I also agree that the Western leaders made mistakes, for instance, canceling the Russian language, that was outright stupid and provocative. But it's not murderous, actually.
All right, we have a reaction from one viewer saying, Putin wants the Cold War attitudes and the West can't force Russia out of Crimea. The focus now on deterring further invasion of eastern Ukraine. Douglas Herbert, is there a sense that it's not going to be just about Crimea?
Well, we're already seeing, obviously, you know, movements throughout cities from Kharkiv to Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. You know, one of the questions you could ask is the extent to which some of this is whipped up and fabricated, and the images we see don't really represent or reflect the true will of the population. I just wanted to go back to a point we've been concentrating and speaking so much about the pro-Russian elements here, the ethnic Russian, obviously, component of Crimea. It is 60% Russian, just under 60% ethnic Russian. But let's not forget that there's a significant minority of the population who are Crimean Tatars, who also live in Crimea. It's their home. Ukrainian speakers, so to speak, almost a quarter of the population. And I would like to point out that although they've been a very small minority, at the various places we've been going to, very brave souls have been showing up at some of these occupied sites, if you want to call it that, these military installations, parliament buildings, airports, people actually wearing Ukrainian flag bands. We saw a bunch of young women today coming out to support, for instance, the Ukrainian soldiers inside the barracks. We met one young woman who was in tears, basically, saying that she considered this an occupation of her country, of Ukraine. Another woman telling us she felt real relief with the new governments in Kiev, that perhaps there'd be a chance of Ukraine rebuilding itself as a real democracy, a new nation for the 21st century. She feels that's being stamped out right now. We've heard some reports, and I haven't actually seen this with my own eyes, of some Tatars. There have been sporadic demonstrations of Tatars who are starting to, a little bit of a backlash among them, and some of them are actually reportedly starting to move their family members out. They're a little apprehensive, to say the least, and at most scared for their future, given the evolving situation here. What would a Crimea be like if you had this very, very dominant, virulent strain of ethnic Russians dominating, led by Russia? So it's a very sort of patchwork ethnic mosaic here, which you really have to keep in mind. It's not just ethnic Russians.
All right, Kurt Volker, let me ask you, you just heard what Douglas said about the situation right now, this standoff. How is it going to end in the Crimean Peninsula? What's going to happen in the coming days?
Well, I don't think anybody can really say with any certainty. Russia seems to have adopted a strong military course here, sending troops into Crimea, threatening to do so elsewhere, seeing movements around, as was just mentioned, in Donetsk or Kharkiv. So I think that we are going to see continued firm military support, if not escalation, from the side of Russia. What we don't know is whether that is going to be sufficient for Russia, just the eastern Ukraine and Crimea, or whether they will seek to reverse the change of government in Kiev. Clearly, the objective of the West, the United States now, is to show as much political solidarity as possible in pushing back on these Russian efforts, showing support for the authorities in Kiev. We have Secretary Kerry going there tomorrow, and I know that there are other ministers and Western leaders who are visiting there to try to show that kind of support. But ultimately, Russia has adopted on a course of force and pressure, and that has to be resisted. And we'll see whether sanctions or threats of economic pressure, as Secretary Kerry mentioned, on Russian economic interests, on Russian individuals, will be enough to cause Putin and Russia to pause and stop, in which case you can then start to try to rebuild governance in Ukraine and inclusiveness in Ukraine, or whether he will just simply calculate that whatever the penalties are, they're going to ride them out now, and they have more staying power than the West does in such a pursuit. And we could see a very aggressive course from Russia in the coming days.
Again, the U.S. Senate has been debating that very question. The question on everyone's lips on this side of the Atlantic, laid bare by UK tabloid The Sun, with the question it put on its front page this Monday, asking, "Come on, if you have a go, if EU think about if you're hard." There you see Vladimir Putin bare-chested. The answer, what is the EU going to do about it? The answer, something, according to the UK Foreign Secretary, who was in Kiev earlier.
Russia cannot be persuaded to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. There will have to be other consequences and other costs. And now I'm not going to set out today what all of those are. We will act in a united way with other nations in the world.
Joelle GARRIAUD, you mentioned in part one the mistakes that have been made in the past.
Yes.
But going forward now, should there be sanctions?
Well, I was an advocate of sanctions against Ukrainian corrupt politicians. Of course, there should be sanctions, but before that, I think we need to negotiate long and hard. That's the only solution. I'm a strong believer.
But the West is negotiating and Putin is moving troops.
Yes, we don't have that much negotiating power at the moment. But I really do think it's not in the interest of Russia to escalate into violence, into a war. That's a very big danger, that there may be a spark and some violence like there was in Kiev. And I'm sure Putin is a very bright man.
So you're saying it's too early for sanctions?
It's a very difficult question to ask. We've been talking so much about sanctions without implementing them that, yes, we should have the sanctions. But more than anything, we need to talk with Putin. And I hope that Merkel, and I regret that Holland and French government hasn't been doing more of that. We really need to talk with them. You know, there are some elements which need to be taken into account. And I'm pretty sure, because it's not Putin's interest, that he will probably back down. One thing which is so important, we need to rebuild Ukraine, and we only talk in terms of confrontation between Russian help or European help. It shouldn't be that way. We should all sit together around the table and say, what can we do and how can we help together to build again democracy in Ukraine? And I'm sure that if we negotiate along this positive base, we can move forward and hopefully not have any blood in the streets of Crimea.
All right, Kurt Volker, you agree that more dialogue is needed before pressing the sanctions button?
Well, I just fundamentally disagree with that last point. Unfortunately, I think Putin has made clear he's not interested in democracy in Ukraine. He's not interested in a dialogue. He's interested in asserting power, in asserting a sphere of influence and preventing Ukraine from making a strategic choice for its own future and towards the West. So I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of dialogue to be had with Russia about restoring democracy in Ukraine.
Celestine.
I mean, I guess, you know, I think that it's always good to remember that the Russians are very good chess players. And what, you know, at the end of the day, and in fact, two of your Russian guests this evening have said Russia doesn't want to occupy Ukraine. I think it always pays to listen to what people say because sometimes they mean it. And at the end of the day, I think it's a bargaining position. It's a powerful one. They've taken control of somebody else's land and put their boots all over it. So it's not the way to go in the international diplomatic rules, but at the same time, I do believe that they are trying to sort of position their forces to do what? We don't know, but it's not to take over Ukraine, not to fight a partisan war with the Western Ukrainians. I mean, at the end of the day, as if they want to protect their interests, they're going to have to help bring some kind of a peaceful element. The question is how we negotiate and how hard we negotiate. And I don't think negotiations have to be a sign of softness. I mean, I think you can be tough. And I think there are measures. And I think that their economy is not in a very pretty position.
Of course, when it comes to bargaining, the U.S. and Europe are not in the same place necessarily. Europe, which gets 1/3 of its oil and gas from Russia, there's the talk of targeting the oligarchs in Russia who've put their cash into London real estate and European banks. But don't hold your breath, argues journalist and author Ben Judah in Politico. He says in an article entitled the Why Russia No Longer Fears the West, the EU could, with a sudden rush of money laundering investigations and visa bans, cut them off from their wealth. But time and again, they've watched European governments balk at passing anything remotely similar to the U.S. Magnitsky Act, which bars a handful of criminal officials from entering the United States. What do you say when people from America say, well, Europeans don't have as much bite when it comes to taking on the Russians?
It's very true. In terms of these individual sanctions, we need to strike where it hurts. And these individual sanctions against the oligarchs... Do you wish there was a European Magnitsky Act? I think it would be extremely useful. Yes, we should have one. And because we have to act, we have to have a united voice, we've got to work together. I'm an optimist, I'm trying to be an optimist. I mean, I feel it's my duty as a politician, but we need to move forward. But I still keep on thinking that Russia won't go as far as we are afraid it will go at the moment. I really feel it's a question of flexing one's muscles, obviously restoring one's influence. They want to have a much bigger influence on all these countries. They don't want a closer association of Ukraine with NATO. That's quite obvious. But I keep on thinking they won't go as far as getting to a partition of Ukraine, I hope.
Michael on our Facebook page saying the best option at this point seems to be as much political and economic isolation of Russia as possible. I want to pick up on what you just said with France 24's Douglas Herbert, who's been reporting there from the Crimean Peninsula. Doug, you told us about the strong language used by ethnic Russians that you've been speaking to. The Russian citizens, how do they feel about it? Those that are not Ukrainian citizens.
Yeah. First of all, let's define our terms very carefully here, because technically, Russia has been stepping up reportedly, but also in fact handing out actual Russian passports to ethnic Russians here. So we have to distinguish between, people who are Russian, they're ethnically Russian in origin. It doesn't necessarily mean they're Russian citizens. That could change very soon. Russians are not a monolithic bloc here. As I was saying earlier, the Russians we have tended to encounter, because we're journalists showing up at the flashpoints, we go to these points where we have the Russian commandos, the silent men in green camouflage surrounding these buildings. So you have the more virulent elements of the Russian-speaking community showing up there. The rah-rah slogan chanters, the flag wavers, people chanting Russia, Russia, Sebastopol, Sebastopol, and all of that. But you also have, and we've been reporting this in recent days, at some of the rallies, I have seen Russians holding up signs saying, I am Russian, and I want to live in Ukraine. So just because you happen to be a Russian speaker doesn't mean you necessarily share this virulent streak of pro-Russian nationalism and want to join Russia. When they talk about the referendum here, I've asked many people, well, what question do you want to be asked on that referendum? What is this referendum? What would it be about? Now, yes, it could be about Crimea ultimately rejoining Russia, but it could also be about greater autonomy. And some people don't want that at all. I've spoken to Russians here who simply want to live in harmony with other people in Crimea, in Ukraine, and they do not have this ultra-nationalist agenda, this pro-Putin, pro-Russia agenda. So I think we have to be very careful of speaking of Russian speakers as this monolithic bloc. They have many views. We've spoken to many people who seem to almost be very measured and apprehensive at the same time of some of the things they see happening, and almost ashamed of some of the more virulent pro-Russian nationalists who've been showing up at some of these occupied sites and military installations.
On Facebook, Anthony saying, so the West backed the undemocratic ousting of the elected government, although the previous government agreed to an early election. Let me ask you, Dmitry LINNIK, what would you like to see in that referendum that's been slated for March the 30th? What would you like to see the question be?
Well, I would like to see, first of all, that, you know, I've been listening to talk about democracy and legitimacy. Let's go back a week, slightly more, 2 weeks now, to February 21st, the agreement signed by 3 foreign ministers of the EU. Within hours, that agreement was torn to pieces under an onslaught from the more virulent, to use your reporter's words, streak of the opposition. I understand and I respect the unhappiness of broad sections of the Ukrainian population, of all of Ukraine, with the previous government, the government of President Yanukovych. But the agenda was hijacked by those more radical elements in Kiev. And from Kiev, we know that groups of activists, you know, the Western press tended to call them protesters, but they're really more like militants who attacked the police in Kiev, in Maidan Square, with Molotov cocktails and all manner of tools. They went out to pro-Russian, basically, cities in the east of the country, such as Donetsk, Lugansk, Dnipropetrovsk, Odessa, and whatnot. There are a lot of them. And they overtook local administration buildings. They effectively staged a coup in those local areas. Now, when there's counter-wave of pro-Russian, and it's not pro-Putin, it's pro-Russian. Let's not mix the two.
I'm sorry, but you know, Dmitry, we didn't hear of any disturbances in places like Donetsk, just protests that have begun that are pro-Russian protests the last couple of days. We haven't heard of any of this up till now.
No. I'm talking about a few days before that.
Right.
At the height of the sort of the Maidan
So just very briefly, what would your
victory.
question be in that referendum?
I don't know. It's up to the people of Crimea. But of course, it's not for Russia to decide what the question may be or indeed what the outcome can be.
Kurt Volker, going forward now, could this spin out of control?
It certainly could. I think there's a great danger of that. As Celestine BOHLEN said, she doesn't expect Russia to go further and further, or maybe it was the French senator. But the fact is that in the last week, Russia has gone farther than any of us, I think, would have thought prudent or reasonable. And I think we stand to still be surprised by how far Russia is willing to go. I hope that perhaps the most that Russia has in mind is a model such as it has in Transnistria or Abkhazia or South Ossetia, where it effectively occupies parts of its neighboring countries and then keeps those governments a bit off balance in order to continue to exercise influence. That might be the most stable outcome we could see in the short term. But I think it is very there's a great risk that Russia will seek to go further at this point.
Are you saying that that's the best the West can hope for, an Abkhazia-like status?
Short term, yes. In the short term, I think that's as far as we could get is to stabilize the situation we have, which is already something of a de facto Russian occupation of Crimea and probably impending in eastern Ukraine. What we would love to see is a Ukraine where the people of Ukraine can have an inclusive government that respects all of the citizens of Ukraine, and they can make their own decisions about the way forward. Getting back to that kind of situation is going to be a matter of a long period of time, because it's going to require Russia to unwind a lot of this direct intervention that it's already embarked on.
And applying sanctions, is that going to make Vladimir Putin even more defiant?
Well, I think that sanctions have an effect. And so while he will resist sanctions and he will push harder and he will perhaps even lash out, as was also suggested, in the end, if we have some staying power, I think sanctions do have an effect, and they gives a basis for then negotiating. But at the moment, Putin is holding all of the cards because he has the will to act and the will to use force. And thus far, we have been very reticent coming from the United States and Europe.
All right, Kurt Volker, I want to thank you for joining us from Washington. I want to thank as well Dmitry LINNIK from the Voice of Russia for being with us from London, Douglas Herbert from the Crimean Peninsula, Joelle GARRIAUD MAYLAM, and Celestine BOHLEN. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.